Hey everybody, this is a piece by Alec Nove, or Alec Nova. One day I'll know precisely actually how to pronounce his name. But it's titled New Light on Trotsky's Economic Views. This was published in Slavic Review in spring 1981. So here we go. Let me duplicate this real quick. I'm sure I don't know, maybe there will be endnotes. Oh no, there's footnotes. Sick. Okay, so here we go. This paper should begin with a series of disclaimers. It cannot pretend to be an analysis of all of Trotsky's ideas on economics and the economy, because this would call for a long book, and because this author has not gone through the Trotsky archives or read all the relevant published works. There is plenty of room for much more research on these matters, and I hope that Barak Knaipass's admirable book on Trotsky's political ideas will be followed by one that, quote, reconstitutes the great many fragments in which Trotsky's economic ideas are presented. Trotsky was not a professional economist any more than Lenin was, but Trotsky did have much to say on economic affairs. What I shall do here is describe and analyze some of Trotsky's more important opinions and pronouncements. Let us begin with aspects of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. I can be brief, because of the skill with which Knaipass has discussed the essential points of the argument. The theory contains highly original analysis of the political economy of unevenness and backwardness in general, and of Russia's backwardness in particular. More than those of any other Marxist, Trotsky's ideas of this period, in association with Parvis's, explain why, quote, socialist revolutions occur in the less developed countries where the working class is in a minority. Trotsky did insist that there be sufficient development to have a working class concentrated in large industrial complexes and imbued with militant class consciousness, such as Trotsky saw in the Russia of 1905 and later in 1917. Trotsky would doubtless have mocked the notion of a, quote, socialist Ethiopia, where a small body of leaders substitute themselves for a virtually non-existing working class, but there are quite a few countries in the world today at a level of industrial development similar to that which Russia had in the first decade of this century. Trotsky saw the contradictory position of the Tsarist regime, anxious to industrialize so as to catch up to the more developed West, at least militarily, yet distrustful of its own bourgeoisie and relying heavily on foreign loans. Foreign capitalists played a substantial role in Russia's industrialization and railway building. The, quote, native bourgeoisie was weak and would be unable to govern or carry out the bourgeois democratic revolution. The peasants, though rebellious over the land question, would not be an independent political force. The workers would have to carry through the bourgeois democratic revolution, but once roused, would not and could not be stopped there. They would go on to challenge the bourgeois order. It would thus be possible to leap over the stages of developed capitalism. In the course of uneven development, revolutionary opportunities would or could appear in less developed areas. Quote, the theory of permanent revolution, end quote, Trotsky was to write much later, quote, which gave the prognosis of the October Revolution, was based on the law of unevenness, in the form of the social and political peculiarities of Russia, end quote. Trotsky. (1930). At the time, this view challenged Marxian orthodoxy. Lenin himself thought it absurd. Trotsky believed that the actual course of the Russian Revolution confirmed his analysis. Lenin's concept of a, quote, democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasants, end quote, operating within the bounds of a bourgeois revolution was indeed impossible to realize, as Trotsky had predicted. It is also worth referring to a work written by Trotsky in 1921 titled On the Historical Peculiarities of Russia, which was published in the volume entitled 1905. Here, arguing against Pokrovsky's attempt to squeeze Russian history into the all-European mold, Trotsky made the point that Russia's backwardness and historical experience had great influence both on the possibility of the Bolshevik Revolution and on the problems that had arisen after power was seized. Footnote: This would certainly be in line with the interpretation of Trotsky's thought by Kanai Paz, as against, for instance, that of Isaac Deutscher. It is odd that Kanai Paz made no reference to this work in his book. End footnote. Another of Trotsky's ideas, which may have influenced his theoretical and practical analysis, is that of the, quote, United States of Europe, end quote. In articles written during 1914 to 1915, Trotsky took the view, well summarized by Richard Day, quote, that international trade had rendered the nation-state economically and historically superfluous, end quote. Trotsky. Richard Day. Richard Day, not Trotsky. That's from Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation. Richard Day's big book on Trotsky. More important is the stress Trotsky laid on the interdependence of the industrialized countries, on the importance of the international division of labor, and Day is right to note this. Did the notion of the, quote, permanent revolution, or the idea of the, quote, United States of Europe, play roles in Trotsky's policies and in theories after the seizure of power? Trotsky himself denied the relevance of, quote, permanent revolution to the Soviet 20s, though Trotsky's opponents, anxious to discredit Trotsky, worked the idea into a doctrine they called, quote, Trotskyism. I shall return to these questions when I examine Day's interpretation of Trotsky's position on the issue of socialism in one country. Let us pass on to Trotsky's ideas in the period of war communism. During 1918 to 1919, Trotsky was heavily engaged in tasks which can have left him little time for economic questions, though in 1920 it was Trotsky who presented the economic report to the 9th Communist Party Congress. It seems, as Trotsky himself afterward admitted, that he shared in the illusions of the bulk of his comrades about how a planned economy would be run after the seizure of power. Neither Trotsky nor Lenin nor other Bolsheviks had any notion of the realities of economic problems other than those that could be attributed to the contradictions of capitalism. Quote, we expected the Nachalnik, end quote. Trotsky wrote later, quote, to turn into a simple technical agent, end quote, under workers' control. They all had much to learn. Let me cite Trotsky again, quote, how did we start? There was a market, we liquidated the market. Competition, we abolished it. Commercial calculation, out with it. The Supreme Council for the National Economy allocated everything from a single center. This failed, end quote. Trotsky. Furthermore, failure was not just because of Russian backwardness, for Trotsky went on to say that, quote, if in Germany the workers were to seize power now, we would not advise them to ... put everything under a Supreme Economic Council, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky naturally attributes the excesses of the period both to illusions and errors and to the necessities of war, with stress mainly on the necessities of war. Quote, once having taken power, it is impossible to accept one set of consequences at will and refuse to accept others. If the capitalist bourgeoisie consciously and malignantly transforms the disorganization of production into a method of political struggle, with the object of restoring power to itself, the proletariat is obliged to resort to socialization. The proletariat is obliged to resort to socialization, independent of whether this is beneficial or otherwise at the given moment. And, once having taken over production, the proletariat is obliged, under the pressure of iron necessity, to learn by its own experience a most difficult art, that of organizing a socialist economy. Having mounted the saddle, the rider is obliged to guide the horse, in peril of breaking his neck, end quote. Trotsky. And that's from The Defense of Terrorism and Communism, which I recently downloaded. I've been meaning to read. In his speech to the 11th Communist Party Congress in 1922, Trotsky again justified the, quote, economically irrational, end quote, all-round nationalization by political military necessity, mentioning in particular the resistance of the owning classes and the owning classes' links with counter-revolution, as well as more purely military exigencies. Also, although Trotsky himself is known to have proposed the introduction of a tax in kind much earlier than the tax in kind was in fact introduced, the tax in kind was not a fundamental point in Trotsky's mind. It was clear to Trotsky, as it must have been to Lenin, that peasant agriculture could not but be discouraged and its output reduced, should requisitioning podrazvetska be continued indefinitely. Trotsky's main personal contribution to the economics of war communism was undoubtedly the militarization of labor. Here, too, Trotsky was largely in line with other Bolsheviks. Lenin repeatedly went on record in favor of mobilizing labor for compulsory service, as it is implied by the slogan, quote, "Who does not work does not eat," end quote. Decrees on labor mobilization, with penalties for non-compliance, were numerous at this time. Bukharin wrote of, quote, "the liquidation of so-called freedom of labor," end quote, of the need to overcome, quote, "individualism, guild-like seclusion, lack of solidarity," end quote, among the workers. Quote, "Indeed, freedom of labor is irreconcilable with a correctly organized planned economy," end quote. Bukharin. While doubtless greatly influenced by the desperate emergency of the period, like Bukharin, Trotsky generalized about the transition period as a whole. Consider Trotsky's argument, as set out in his speech to the 9th Communist Party Congress, quote, "As a general rule, man tries to avoid work. We could say that man is a rather lazy animal," end quote. Trotsky. After remarking that laziness has laziness's progressive aspects, and that laziness encourages the search for labor-saving devices, and adding that Trotsky was not advancing a party campaign in favor of laziness, Trotsky continued, quote, "The task of social organization is to insert laziness into a definite framework, to discipline and stimulate laziness with the help of the social organization of work. ... In the military field, there exists a proper machinery of compelling soldiers to perform their duty. In one form or another, this must also happen with regard to labor. No doubt, if we speak seriously about a planned economy, encompassed by a uniform central conception, when labor is allocated according to the economic plan at a given stage of development, the mass of workers must not be wandering about Russia. They must be directed, nominated, commanded in the same manner as soldiers. This is the basis of the militarization of labor, and without it, under the conditions of devastation and hunger, we cannot speak seriously of any industry standing on new foundations," end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky went on to deny that the use of conscript labor would lead to low productivity. Quote, "The arguments raised here against the organization of the labor army are directed entirely against socialist organization of the economy in our transitional period, ... Of course, ... we could outline the perspectives, ... for a socialist economy. Their coercion will gradually disappear and fade away. In a well-organized socialist economy, the elements of coercion will no longer be felt as such, since work, ... will become a need for every member of society, ... However, end bracket, in the period of transition, coercion plays an immense role in organizing work, and if forced labor is unproductive, this condemns our economy," end quote. Trotsky. Meanwhile, military discipline in factories plus labor direction would be enforced by penalties against deserters, including penal work battalions and, quote, "internment in concentration camps," end quote, with trade unions enforcing these policies. A key element for Trotsky was that labor direction and coercion would continue throughout the transition period. Until, in the, quote, "well-organized socialist economy," end quote, everyone will do what needs to be done of his own free will. This clearly is not based on a temporary military emergency. L. Gemueli is right to comment that this, as well as Bukharin's similar view at this time, stemmed from denying a role for material incentives. If labor is needed to perform various tasks, and if labor cannot be persuaded by inducement, carrot, there is no alternative to orders backed by the threat of punishment for non-compliance, stick. If Trotsky had intended his ideas to relate to the immediate critical situation, Trotsky could have claimed that the material means for incentives were lacking in the circumstances of 1920. Trotsky did not say this. Trotsky was not the first, and certainly not the last, later to regret a theoretical leap from the particular to the general. Certainly after 1921, we hear no more justification of forced labor. Trotsky must have been greatly influenced by the appalling situation of 1920, when the army seemed to be the only effective organized force, and contrasted sharply with the bureaucratic ineptitude of early civilian planning and allocation. As Commissar for War, Trotsky favored the use and promotion of, quote, bourgeois specialists, end quote, and the necessities of discipline and order in repressing the tendency toward anarchy below. Trotsky could see advantages in the use of battalions for reconstruction. In the same capacity, Trotsky became accustomed to giving military orders, to imposing discipline by terror. Clearly, Trotsky had no time for the, quote, left communist, end quote, ideas on factory committees and the like, any more than Trotsky tolerated soldiers' committees. Under war communism, Trotsky became identified with stern discipline in all spheres. Indeed, Trotsky could not see why the obedience demanded of soldiers should not be extended to other workers, especially in the critically disorganized sphere of transport, or why trade unions should not be part of a mechanism of quasi-military state control. Like Bukharin, Trotsky was very conscious of the existence of sectional interest among the workers and was convinced that the Soviet state must enforce the general interest of the proletariat upon the proletariat. This is an interesting example of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, in substitutionism's purest form. The predominantly intellectual leadership claims to know what the working class should want, and is therefore entitled to order actual workers to act accordingly, regardless of what these workers might want. Trotsky was also aware, as was Bukharin, of the shortage of capital and of the need to replace capital with human labor. Bukharin's original 1920 reference to, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote, was in terms of the mobilization of labor for socialist construction. Trotsky used this term several years later in his speech to the 12th Communist Party Congress in April 1923, but was clearly thinking along similar lines, if not in the same terminology in 1920. As some may still think that Trotsky differed fundamentally with Lenin on this issue, it is well to stress that it was Lenin who wrote that, quote, the unions have to be statified, the unions have to be fused with state bodies, end quote. Lenin. And Lenin certainly also supported measures of labor conscription, quote, military methods, ruthlessness, end quote, and so forth. But Trotsky made many enemies through arrogance and a tendency to authoritarian solutions. Lenin found that Trotsky's ideas on the role of trade unions as agencies of state coercion, as distinct from transmission belts for the party, went too far. After all, Lenin pointed out, the workers do need protection from a state with bureaucratic deformations. Lenin seemed to have sensed by the end of 1920 that the need for concessions to the view that the party had moved too far in the direction of all-round militarization. Trotsky was thus associated in the minds of many party leaders and ordinary citizens with centralization, militarization, and authoritarianism. This certainly did not help Trotsky later when Trotsky wished to appeal to party democracy and the working class. Trotsky, asserted Stephen Cohen, was really a, quote, nepist, end quote. Footnote. See Stephen Cohen, Bolshevism and Stalinism, in Robert C. Tucker's edited volume, Stalinism. End footnote. It is hard to disagree with this judgment. Trotsky was quick to see both the necessity and the logic of the NEP, though Trotsky was certainly also aware that the NEP posed dangers. Trotsky learned fast from the poor performance of centralized planning under war communism. Trotsky learned also about the complexities of real economic life, that production units are interdependent and must be interlinked, for otherwise production units will be, quote, like a telephone whose wires have been cut, end quote. Trotsky. The market mechanism is needed. One day a socialism would arise in which there could be the kind of planning envisaged by Marx, that is, an end to commodity production, but there would be a long, quote, transition period, end quote. In the meantime, there would have to, quote, B. Recourse to capitalist methods of calculation, end quote, not just in backward Russia, but, quote, even in Germany, end quote. Trotsky. Yes, the market gives rise to unpleasant phenomena. Private traders make profits and spend them in the ER restaurant, a gypsy music establishment well known before the revolution and apparently notorious again in 1922. Some comrades wish to take measures against ER, but it is, said Trotsky, a consequence of the necessary reliance on trade and the market. In April 1923, Trotsky had the task of presenting a long report on industry to the 12th Communist Party Congress. Trotsky had been appointed chairman of the Committee to Plan Industrial Policy and had been at odds since with Sokolnikov over the finance commissar's insistence on stern financial measures to ensure a balanced budget and successful transition to a stable currency. This policy inevitably hurt industry, and Trotsky expressed the opinion that the needs of industry should be given greater priority, even going so far as to speak of, quote, the dictatorship of industry, end quote. As Trotsky also accepted the urgent need for a stable currency and balanced budget, however, the issue was actually one of degree, with Sokolnikov representing what in Britain is called the, quote, treasury view, end quote. Trotsky presented the then party line to the Congress with some colorful language of his own. Though the market was clearly essential, Trotsky twice referred to realizing the, quote, market devil, end quote. Releasing the, quote, market devil. An expanded socialist sector was vital. The link, Smichka, with the peasants was vital too, taking at first the form of an exchange largely of consumer goods through the market mechanism. Higher levels would be attained when the state was able to supply machines. It was important to stimulate peasant agriculture, quote, the peasants should become richer, end quote. Shades of Bukharin's heretical slogan of 1925. Footnote. As we shall see, Trotsky was still taking a similar line in 1925. Bukharin claimed in the course of a polemic against Trotskyism that the Central Committee insisted that a reference to the importance of the peasant economy be inserted into the draft of Trotsky's report on industry, and that Trotsky demurred, saying that, quote, while in itself correct, end quote, it should not figure in the text of a resolution on industry. In light of what Trotsky wrote subsequently on the importance of the peasant market, this might seem to be a polemical distortion by Bukharin. End footnote. Trotsky pointed out that state industry is high cost, inefficient, and loss-making. These losses should be eliminated, even though one cannot close down essential heavy industries. It is indeed bad that, by contrast, the NEP bourgeoisie makes profits and seems to be competing effectively with the inefficient state industry. The peasants, meanwhile, suffer from the, quote, price scissors, end quote. Trotsky presents the scissors-like price index diagram, which is bad for agricultural production, and the Smichka. Solution: export grain, taking advantage of Western Europe's dollar shortage. This would cause a rise in agricultural prices within Russia and give the state, as the trading intermediary, a profit. More goods, machines, materials, even more consumer goods could then be imported. Meanwhile, state industry should be concentrated to ensure lower costs by fuller capacity utilization, subject to stricter accountancy and a reduction in inflated handling costs. There must be strict economy. Proper accountancy must include provision for amortization and also for land rent. The state monopoly of foreign trade must be preserved to prevent penetration of Western capital and a link up with domestic petty bourgeois elements, particularly because Western manufacturers are so much cheaper. The USSR is still so poor, Trotsky held, that the United States could, for instance, buy the USSR outright. There must, of course, be a state plan for industrial development. The immediate prospect was for plan and market, with the socialist sector fighting in the market by the methods of the market. The new economic policy, though intended, quote, seriously and for a long time, end quote, will ultimately be overcome by the new economic policy itself. These sentiments were not far off those of Bukharin, who at the same time was urging effective competition by state industry and trade with the quote privateers as distinct from the war communism methods. There is indeed not a word in Marx about suppressing the petty bourgeoisie by mass arrests under objective conditions favorable to its existence. Preobrazhensky, in his quote futuristic work, end quote, From NEP to Socialism, written in 1922, envisages the gradual squeezing out of the private sector through the superior efficiency and lower costs of the modernizing socialist sector. Nothing here suggests that Trotsky was opposed to the NEP and the NEP's essential principles. He differed with Sokolnikov both on the extent of the cuts to be made in financial subsidies to unprofitable industries and over the importance of the monopoly of foreign trade. Trotsky also placed greater emphasis on the need to plan for industrial expansion, but it is essential to recall the situation of 1923. Currency was still only partially stabilized. The price scissors, as everyone, including Trotsky, agreed, were too wide. The need to attend the peasant market was universally acknowledged, as was the fact that to achieve higher agricultural marketings, wealthier peasants had to be encouraged to produce and sell more. There was little room for maneuver, and it is very doubtful whether had Trotsky been in a position of power during, say, 1923 to 25, would have, or would wish to have, substantially altered the policy then being followed by the party leadership. In later years, Trotsky, as well as Trotskyist, was to assert that if the party had followed the economic policies he had advocated then and not waited until 1928, many troubles would have been avoided. I have yet to see these propositions tested in terms of actual feasibilities of the time. That is not to say that the actual policy pursued was correct. One could challenge certain decisions, demand somewhat different priorities. Thus Trotsky was right to assert that some of the difficulties in the village, including the power of the kulak over poor peasants, were due to undersupply of agricultural equipment, including simple tools, which often had to be hired from the richer peasants. Kulaks could have been taxed more, though Trotsky himself warned against this in his speech to the 12th Communist Party Congress. It is also true that the higher industrial production would have stimulated a higher level of interchange with the peasants and higher productivity in agriculture, but everyone, including Bukharin, agreed that this was desirable. The problem was how to achieve it. Quickly, within the framework of the new economic policy and the material constraints on a country just recovering from hunger and economic ruin, those who say that Trotsky had a dramatically different practicable alternative have some research to do. Some consider that Trotsky advocated an all-embracing plan in 1923 and that Trotsky and Preobrazhensky saw the, quote, law of value, that is, market forces, and the planning principle as mutually incompatible. It is true that Trotsky advocated more planning and that Trotsky was conscious of the need to strengthen the state, socialist, sector as against private enterprise. Of course, Trotsky shared the views of other theorists, including Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, concerning the socialism/communism of the ultimate future. However, Trotsky's commitment to the new economic policy, and indeed to the market, in the conditions of the time, is quite clear. In a letter to the Central Committee, dated October 8, 1923, Trotsky bases his analysis on the smichka with the peasants, draws attention to the bad effect of the price scissors, attacks decrees that, quote, mechanically lower prices in response to political pressures, end quote, which, quote, in most cases merely enriches the middlemen and has no effect on peasant markets, end quote. Instead of, quote, planned and manipulative adjustment, end quote, to the market, one has, quote, attempts to command price in the style of war communism, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky, The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1923 to 25. End footnote. A second letter from October 24, 1923, puts Trotsky's views on planning in even clearer perspective. Trotsky speaks of, quote, overall guidance in planning, that is, the systematic coordination of the fundamental sectors of the state-run economy in the process of adapting them to the growing market. The systematic coordination of the fundamental sectors of the state-run economy in the process of adapting them to the growing market, end quote. Trotsky. In his important pamphlet, The New Course, written in 1923, but published in 1924, the same points are made with still greater emphasis. Quote, even in the proletarian revolution triumphs in the, even if the proletarian revolution triumphs in the West, we'll have to base ourselves in large measure on the middle peasant and draw him into the, quote, into the socialist economy, end quote. Trotsky, The New Course. Trotsky reminds Trotsky's readers of Trotsky's proposal to abandon requisitioning of peasant produce, which antedated the NEP by a year. Trotsky notes that the existence of the market, quote, extraordinarily complicates, end quote, the task of planning. Clearly, however, quote, for the next period, we shall have a planned state economy aligning itself more and more with the peasant market, and, as a result, adapting itself to the latter in the course of its growth, end quote. One should, quote, by means of exact knowledge of market conditions and correct economic forecasts, harmonize state industry with agriculture according to a definite plan, end quote. Quote, in the struggle for the domination of the market, planned economy is our principal weapon, end quote. Trotsky. The New Course. Where the hell am I? Clearly, however, quote, for the next period, we shall have a planned economy aligning that planned economy self more and more with the peasant market, and as a result, adapting that planned state economy self to the peasant market in the course of its growth, end quote. Trotsky. One should, quote, by means of exact knowledge of market conditions and correct economic forecasts, harmonize state industry with agriculture according to a definite plan, end quote. Trotsky. Quote, in the struggle for the domination of the market, planned economy is our principal weapon, end quote. Socialist state industry, Trotsky went on, should not be subjected to financial considerations too inflexibly and should satisfy the peasant market, thus turning, quote, this smichka from the realm of mere rhetoric to the realm of economic reality, end quote. Trotsky. The kulak, the private trader, can then be kept in bounds. Lenin's maxim, quote, better fewer but better, end quote, lays down the correct policy. Trotsky asserted, that is, quote, we must adapt the Soviet state to the needs and strength of the peasantry while preserving its character as a workers' state. We must adapt Soviet industry to the peasant market, on the one hand, and to the taxable capacity of the peasant, on the other, while preserving its character as a state, that is, socialist industry. Only in this way shall we be able to avoid destroying the equilibrium of our Soviet state until the revolution will have destroyed the equilibrium in the capitalist states, bracket, it is, end bracket, not enough to preach, smichka, that what is needed is the effective adaptation of industry to the rural economy, end quote. Trotsky. Owing to the lack of a plan, quote, the different parts of our state industry, coal, metals, machinery, cloth, do not mesh with each other, end quote, causing disproportions, high cost, and so forth. Again, Trotsky deplores, quote, lack of coordination of the different elements in the economy, end quote. It is necessary to learn, quote, to forecast their mutual relationships in the process of production, end quote, and to, quote, adapt the whole of industry to the rural economy, end quote. Advocating cheaper industrial production, Trotsky specifically denies that the industrial planning Trotsky advocates contradicts the smichka, for the latter, quote, cannot be realized unless industry is rationally organized, managed in accordance to a definite plan, The correct work of our State Planning Commission is the direct and rational way of approaching successfully the solution of the questions relating to smichka, not by suppressing the market, but on the basis of the market. Not by suppressing the market, but on the basis of the market. End quote. Trotsky. This hardly sounds as if Trotsky is against the market or that Trotsky sees planning as inherently incompatible with the market at this period. The thrust of Trotsky's argument is surely that lack of adequate financing and planned coordination are causing a failure of state industry to adapt itself to the market, and that this has undesirable economic and political consequences. Of course, Trotsky was a political man through and through and not concerned with economic, quote, rationality for economic, quote, rationality's own sake. But Trotsky saw quite clearly the role of the market in relations with the peasantry under the new economic policy. And in this respect, like Bukharin, Trotsky envisaged the conflict between the socialist state and the new economic policy bourgeoisie taking place in the market. Trotsky surely would have agreed with Bukharin that, quote, if the cooperative has no galoshes and the kulak or private trader has, end quote, then, quote, we cannot feed the peasant with good decrees and speeches about Chamberlain, end quote. It must be stressed that it was Zinoviev, not Trotsky, who was then stressing the kulak danger. Indeed, Trotsky opposed measures against kulaks. In September 1925, Trotsky said, quote, the kulak, the rich peasant who sells grain to the state, enables the state to acquire foreign currency with which the state can import machines for our factories. This is a positive factor. It promotes movement towards socialism, end quote. Trotsky. Once again, the difference with Bukharin does not seem great. I must admit to an error of my own in an article about Bukharin, where, influenced by Bukharin's attacks on Trotsky and by statements of Trotskyists, I wrote that Bukharin, unlike Trotsky, was willing to be gradualist, that Trotsky, like Preobrazhensky, would not accept a sort of competitive equilibrium between the private and public sectors, but believed that one must, quote, eat up, end quote, the other. It seems to me that Trotsky's attitude was not the same as Preobrazhensky's, which is perhaps why Preobrazhensky broke with Trotsky when Stalin turned, quote, left in 1928. However, my error was not as great as that of Ernest Mandel. In Ernest Mandel's book on Trotsky, he quotes the new course, but simply omits any mention of the points which have been cited here. Instead, Mandel concentrates on the admittedly important attack on the bureaucratization of the party and summarizes Trotsky's economic policy of the period as, quote, involving, among other things, a rise in real wages, the disappearance of mass unemployment, a general course towards accelerated industrialization, and an increased class war in the countryside, end quote. While still a responsible member of the Politburo, Trotsky could not have advocated such mutually inconsistent policies as these. Higher industrial investment would require sacrifice, and class war in the villages would accentuate the sacrifice by reducing grain marketings. This was during 1923 to 24, when the USSR was just emerging from beggary, starvation, industrial paralysis, and hyperinflation, when industry was still producing well below existing capacity. Surely it is grossly unfair to Trotsky to misrepresent Trotsky's policy at this period. Trotsky's views were different a few years later, but so was the objective situation. Trotsky's view about kulaks and, quote, netmen underwent a gradual change as Trotsky was driven further and further from the seat of power. Partly this was the natural reaction of anyone thrust into opposition and seeking support from other oppositionists. Trotsky must genuinely have felt, however, that the Reconstruction period was coming to an end and that there was intolerable delay in adopting plans for a more rapid industrialization, and that a delay would lead the country into an economic and political cul-de-sac. Trotsky also deeply suspected the policies and attitudes of non-party specialists in the planning organs. Footnote. They also deeply suspected him. End footnote. Trotsky increasingly came to view the Stalin-Bukharin majority as natural allies of the bourgeois elements. Netmen, kulaks, quote, bourgeois specialists. When these were arrested and tried in 1928 and 1930, Trotsky, already himself in exile, approved and believed the accusations! The nearly pro-kulak view Trotsky expressed in 1923 was in any case reversed by 1926, even though the role of the state sector in the economy was already much greater. After 1926, as more steps were taken which upset the delicate equilibrium of the new economic policy, and as price policy in industry and agriculture contributed to goods famine and agricultural procurement crises, Trotsky, without directly opposing the new economic policy or proposing an alternative model, spoke out against the measures which Bukharin and the professional economists urged. Therefore, when Stalin launched his sharp left turn, this caused great confusion among Trotsky's own supporters, though, as we shall see, Trotsky himself subjected Stalin's method of industrialization to severe criticism. It was tragic indeed that Trotsky and Bukharin expended so much energy trying to discredit each other. Trotsky went on denouncing Bukharin even in exile, when they had so much more in common than either had with the man who was to kill them both. Richard Day argues that Trotsky was not opposed to the idea of building socialism in one country, but rejected the feasibility of doing so on an autarkic basis, in a, quote, separate country. The, quote, operative question, end quote, writes Richard Day, quote, was not whether Russia could build socialism in advance of the international revolution, but how to devise an optional planning strategy, taking into account both the existing and future international division of labor, end quote. It says optional here, but I feel like it should say optimal, but I'm not sure. Anyway, end quote. Richard Day. It is common knowledge that Trotsky repeatedly attacked the notion of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, in exile. Nor does anyone, Day included, doubt that, in Trotsky's view, socialism, contrary to Stalin's claim, had not been achieved in the USSR in the 30s. The question at issue is whether Day has the correct interpretation of Trotsky's ideas during the period in which, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, was debated in the USSR, that is, before the final defeat of the opposition. Day concentrates attention on Trotsky's changing attitude toward the role of foreign trade. Such a change took place, but in my view, Day reads too much into it. During the Civil War, the economic isolation of Soviet Russia was a fact which no one could deny or ignore. To talk of, quote, integration, end quote, during the blockade would have been absurd indeed. During 1921 to 22, Trotsky may have been overly pessimistic about the immediate possibilities of obtaining essential supplies, such as locomotives, from the capitalist West. But this was a matter of, perhaps incorrect, judgment of practical possibilities, not a theory. Trotsky was indeed very conscious at this time of the economic weakness of the Soviet Republic, and so was very defensive and protectionist. The penetration of Western goods would be dangerous, given the huge pent-up desire for consumer goods and the poor state of Soviet industry. Western capital would easily take over if allowed to do so, hence the need for strict state monopoly of foreign trade. Hence also the apparently unavoidable need for doing everything possible for oneself. This was, for him, a pis aller, a bitter necessity, an undesirable, if unavoidable, policy. By 1923, Trotsky quite understandably saw more possibilities and advantages in Soviet participation in the international division of labor. It is true that one of Trotsky's reasons for opposing the Stalin-Bukharin group is that the Stalin-Bukharin group appeared to be overemphasizing the aim of self-sufficiency, though of course they all knew that. Initially, many machines would have to be imported from the West. In my view, however, the chief weakness of Day's very interesting argument is that he does not examine the meaning of the word, quote, socialism in the general discussions and in Trotsky's own mind. We all use it extremely loosely and in a number of sometimes contradictory ways. For example, as Day himself points out, Trotsky favored the view that Soviet state industry was socialist against Kamenev's interpretation of Soviet state industry as state capitalist. This equates, quote, socialism with state ownership. Trotsky did not use the word similarly in other contexts. More important are certain other distinctions. One obstacle to the building of socialism in the USSR, when the rest of the world was capitalist, was external military and economic danger. External military and economic danger. Trotsky frequently referred to this, as did others including Bukharin. Another is internal weakness. Internal weakness. The consequence of backwardness and the contradictions of trying to build socialism in a peasant country without aid from the workers of the more developed and richer states, a point Trotsky also made, for instance, in 1922. Both the above arguments could be quite consistent with the view that, quote, socialism could be built in one country if it were safe from military conquest and could overcome its internal weaknesses and contradictions. Finally, there's the idea of socialism as international. International. Seen now in its original Marxist utopian form as a synonym for communism, obviously, separate states are inconsistent with the notion that the state withers away with the overcoming of conflicts under conditions of universal abundance, and so on. In this sense, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, is plainly an illogical and contradictory notion, like, quote, fried ice, end quote, to borrow a term from Plekhanov. Some of today's new leftists use the word, quote, socialism in this way and see Trotsky as the internationalist. It was also possible to argue that while something resembling socialism could be built in one large, strong country, its duty would be to spread world revolution and achieve a world socialist commonwealth. Alvin Gouldner expressed the sort of ideas I have in mind without evidently having read Day when Alvin Gouldner wrote, quote, no leading Bolshevik, including Stalin, seems to have thought that a mature, quote, rounded socialism could be built by or within one country alone. The fundamental issue was the power and security of the Soviet state, not the final victory of socialism, ... Trotsky did not believe that the Soviet state could be secure against capitalist restoration unless the Soviet Revolution spread to industrialized Europe, end quote. Trotsky. Not Trotsky. End quote. Alvin Gouldner. Day correctly reminds us that Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution implies that Trotsky thought that a socialist revolution could be carried through in a country lacking the initial preconditions of capitalist development. Day is also right to stress that Trotsky had to assert that something called socialism could be, quote, built, so long as he was still an active politician in Russia, so as not to appear a pessimist, defeatist, or even a sort of Menshevik. At the very least, Trotsky could see that public opposition to the Stalin-Bukharin claim that socialism could be built would be foolish. It was Zinoviev who put the case strongly, although not very effectively, and it was Preobrazhensky who, in an impressive article, listed the contradictions facing the regime and pronounced them insoluble without a revolution in advanced countries. It is understandable that Trotsky denied, in 1926 and 1927, he was asserting that, quote, socialist construction, end quote, was impossible in one country. In fact, Trotsky pointed out that his advocacy of more rapid rates of industrialization would otherwise be inconsistent. But note the words, quote, socialist construction, or, quote, the building of socialism, end quote, which are quite consistent with the idea that socialism could not be complete in one country, in isolation, any one country, whatever its level of development. Trotsky also stressed the desirability of participating in the world division of labor, saw the economic advantage, indeed necessity, of purchasing capital equipment from the developed West, and thus attacked tendencies to plan autarkically. But is Day justified in resting so much of his case on this one point? Day deserves praise for challenging a number of myths about, quote, Trotskyism, and for bringing to our attention materials and quotations which demonstrate the complexities of Trotsky's thoughts and actions. Incidentally, also Trotsky's political ineptitude at decisive moments. However, for reasons advanced above, my feeling is that Day overstresses the significance of Trotsky's views on isolation versus integration. I will not here discuss the validity and confusion of Trotsky's, quote, Thermidor thesis. Trotsky's failure to identify the real basis of Stalin's power, or the later arguments concerning the, quote, degenerated worker state or the bureaucracy as a, quote, new class. Plainly, it is not enough to denounce the, quote, bureaucracy. It is necessary to account for the bureaucracy's success. If indeed, quote, bureaucracy was the right word to describe those who, with Stalin, led and organized the vast and ruthless, quote, revolution from above, end quote. Hardly typical bureaucratic behavior. I will concentrate here on an odd aspect of Trotsky's thought, odd because it ill accords with elementary Marxism. Here, then, is Trotsky, quote, if the state does not wither away and becomes ever more despotic, if workers' plenipotentiaries turn into bureaucrats, and the bureaucracy raises itself above society, this is due not to some secondary causes, such as psychological remnants of the past, but through iron necessity, to maintain a privileged minority, end quote. Trotsky. In the same work, Trotsky also wrote, quote, while a state of armed workers can defend social ownership against bourgeois counter-revolution, it is quite otherwise in the sphere of consumption, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky also referred to shortage, the need to regulate the queue, as the foundation of the power of the bureaucracy, adding, quote, whoever distributes goods never forgets himself, end quote. Trotsky. This situates the problem in the bureaucracy's self-interest as consumers, yet Marxists in this instance correctly should look to the relations of production. Trotsky missed the point. The one thing that, quote, the state of the armed workers, end quote, itself a romantic fiction, could not do was organize production. How is it that Trotsky could not see that central planning provides both function and power for the, quote, bureaucracy, by making all society dependent for employment on state-owned institutions, and also by the hierarchical form of organization which is necessary for central planning? The privileges in the sphere of consumption are derivative. The consequences of the power over the production of goods and services, over the disposition of the surplus, and over the allocation of labor. Of course, this position is constrained, not limitless, but that is another matter. As I shall show in the next section, Trotsky came close to seeing the inverse relationship between the strength of the market and the power of the, quote, bureaucracy, but he did not draw theoretical conclusions from his insight. I have elsewhere quoted at length from Trotsky's Bulletin Oppositie to show how Trotsky reacted to Stalin's left turn and the disarray of his own supporters scattered in remote places of exile. Trotsky was strongly critical of collectivization and what Trotsky called, quote, prize gallop industrialization, end quote. At first, Trotsky was quite unable to grasp what was happening in the villages, not only because of lack of information, but also because Trotsky mistakenly identified the interests of the, quote, Stalinist bureaucracy with the village rich. And so, given that collectivization was being undertaken without the tractors and other machines on which it ought to have been based, quote, the collective farm can become a new disguise for the kulak, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky had earlier seen the grain procurement crisis of the winter of 1927 to 28 as confirming his analysis that the kulaks were very powerful, and Trotsky attacked the overly modest increase in procurement prices in mid-1928 as a concession to the rich and to market forces. Trotsky treated Stalin's entire left turn as an aberration at first, undertaken as a result of pressure from the opposition and likely to be reversed. As the real situation became apparent, Trotsky did condemn the excesses of collectivization, but in a curiously half-hearted manner. He appeared to favor collectivization in principle, but on a voluntary basis, implying that it would have been possible to carry collectivization through voluntarily if the necessary machinery were available, and that it might have been available had his more ambitious industrialization plans been adopted earlier. Surely we now know that peasants are not converted to collectivization by the sight of tractors, nor is it clear how the opposition proposed simultaneously to increase investment, say in 1926, improve living standards of the workers, encourage higher agricultural production, and provide the incentives necessary to encourage the peasants to join collectives voluntarily and to supply produce without coercion. Trotsky was more convincing in his comments on Stalin's industrialization strategy. Trotsky was able to show that, quote, all arguments against, quote, super-industrialization, end quote, were suddenly abandoned, end quote, and that, quote, heresies which yesterday were called Trotskyist, end quote, became compulsory. Instead of over-caution, there was now over-optimism. Quote, now the slogan is, quote, full speed ahead, end quote, regardless of anything. Their plan is repeatedly revised upward from passive possibilism, parenthesis, question mark, in parenthesis, the opportunists have gone over to unbridled subjectivism, end quote. Trotsky. Occasionally, Trotsky was tempted to use the high growth tempos of the first 5-year plan as evidence both for the correctness of his earlier criticisms of overcaution and as proof of the advantages of a centralized state economy. But the basic thrust is against unsound extremism, with, quote, breaches of all economic and therefore social equilibria, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky deplored falling living standards and bureaucratic arbitrariness. Trotsky's own conception, interestingly enough, included open argument between interest groups. Quote, tractorists, oilmen, electrifiers, end quote, would demand more resources for, quote, their sectors. Suppression of such conflicts facilitated the taking of unsound arbitrary decisions. In exile, Trotsky returned to a pro-market position in contrast with the unbalanced adventurism of Stalin. Trotsky first expressed, quote, pro-market sentiments much earlier, a year after the introduction of the new economic policy. Quote, in the course of the transitional epoch, each enterprise and each set of enterprises must, to a greater or lesser degree, orient itself independently in the market and test itself through the market, ... It is necessary for each state-owned factory with its technical director, ... to be subject not only to control from the top by the state organs, but also from below by the market, which will remain the regulator of the state economy for a long time to come, end quote. Trotsky. First 5 years. It may be thought that this was another instance of making a virtue of necessity. As this was said in 1922, when the new economic policy had just begun, but Trotsky expressed the same ideas in 1933 and repeated them in 1936. Quote, the economy of the transition period is unthinkable without the, quote, control by the ruble, end quote. Trotsky. Later, Trotsky again speaks of the bureaucracy having freed itself both from the control of the masses and from the, quote, automatic control of the chervonets, end quote. Trotsky puts the same argument more strongly in May 1933. Trotsky never fails to stress his belief in the ultimate triumph of communism and therefore in the disappearance of money under conditions of universal abundance. This stage, however, is still very far away. Quote, the function of money in the Soviet economy can in a certain sense only now expand fully. The transition period taken as a whole means not the reduction of commodity turnover, but, on the contrary, its great expansion, end quote. Trotsky. The ending of self-contained peasant household economies through collectivization should in fact contribute to this expansion. Quote, keeping stock of all the productive forces of society, the socialist state has the task of giving them their most productive distribution and use for society. The methods of economic monetary calculation developed under capitalism are not rejected, but are socialized. The construction of socialism is unthinkable without building into the planning system the personal interest of producer and consumer, and this interest can manifest itself only if in its service there is a tried and flexible tool, a stable currency. In particular, a rise in labor productivity and improvements in quality of output are impossible to attain without an accurate measuring rod, freely penetrating to nooks and crannies of the economy, that is, with a stable monetary unit. ... Economic planning frees economic planning self from financial (or market) control, just as bureaucratic arbitrariness frees itself of political control. End quote. Trotsky. These same points, often in the same words, are repeated in 1936, when Trotsky also refers to the advantages of a gold standard. Once again, this is in the context of a contrast between arbitrariness and rational economic calculation, for which purpose one needed, quote, a ruble independent of the leaders, end quote. Trotsky. It is interesting to note how he links the market with democracy. That is how Trotsky saw the demands of citizens through the market as a kind of countervailing power against bureaucrats and planning offices. Trotsky also appreciated that plans could, with the best will in the world, be simply wrong unless influenced by and checked against the market situation. True. In Trotsky's eyes, all this related to the, quote, transition period, end quote. But this is a long way from treating the market and, quote, the law of value, end quote, which manifests itself in the market as an enemy of, quote, socialist construction, end quote. It is a long way, too, from the present-day ideas of the far left, some of whom claim to be Trotskyists. Footnote. But then they well deserve the reproach addressed to them by Regis Debray. For them, quote, anything that actually happens is guilty of compromising with reality, end quote. And, quote, what a posthumous fate for so admirable a man as Trotsky, end quote. Regis Debray. Finally, two other matters require a brief mention. One is the old charge endlessly made that Trotsky, quote, underestimated the peasants, end quote. I'm not sure what this means. Trotsky treated the peasants as an object of policy, showing minimal concern for the peasants' interest and welfare. But Trotsky shared this attitude with Lenin, Stalin, and most Bolshevik leaders. Trotsky may have overestimated the strength and menace of the kulaks. Trotsky's then ally, Zinoviev, certainly did. Maybe Lenin was better able to appreciate the peasants' land hunger as a revolutionary factor before and during the October Revolution, but more one can hardly say. Trotsky also engaged in an interesting dispute with the renowned economist Kondratiev over the nature of long period trade cycles. We owe a debt to Richard Day for drawing attention to this debate in a recent article. Trotsky argued in a civilized manner, stressing the role, as Trotsky saw it, of fluctuations in the intensity of class conflicts. The article being referred to is by Richard Day, and it's titled The Theory of the Long Cycle, Kondratiev, Trotsky, Mandel, published in New Left Review. End footnote. Trotsky argued in a civilized manner, stressing the role, as Trotsky saw it, of fluctuations in the intensity of class conflict. Once again, one must deplore the destruction by Stalin of the debate and both the debaters. Kondratiev, according to information given me verbally by his former deputy, Albert Weinstein, died in a state of mental collapse in prison in 1941. Leon Trotsky will not, of course, be remembered as an economist. Trotsky made errors of analysis. Trotsky was by no means consistent. He was ruthless, arrogant, and the association of his name with workers' democracy ill accords with what he did when he was, in Deutscher's words, quote, the prophet armed, end quote. Trotsky's intolerance of non-Marxists was total, despite his advocacy of the use of, quote, bourgeois expertise in the army and in industry. But he had some important and indeed fascinating ideas. Trotsky was a man of brilliant intellect, and it is ludicrous that now, 40 years after he was murdered on Stalin's orders, it is impossible to have a critical, serious discussion of his role and thought in his own country. Instead, one gets only routine denunciations of, quote, Trotskyism. Okay, so that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.